Well, as you know, I'm here to present the Amy Goodman with the first I.F. Stone Lifetime Achievement Award. And I have to tell you, I was getting out of my apartment, waiting 2 hours on the tarmac to leave Washington to come here. But as I was leaving, I was talking to my wonderful friend and super who's from Ethiopia. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm going to go to Boston and give an award to Amy Goodman." And he stood there and he bowed. And I said, "I've never gotten such a reception from him in 20 years of living there." He said, "She never moves. She is always there. Others come and go, but she is there day in and day out." He rattled off your call numbers. She is so passionate about issues, and she tells the truth. And so all I can tell you is that Kyros Hagos is a living example of the grassroots real people whom you speak for. And I don't think I can get home without an autograph, so you have to give me an autograph for him. I've often thought that if Izzy could have cloned himself, he would have been replicated in Amy. In fact, in examining the similarities in both their large, impressive body of work, I'm not so sure he didn't. Among the similarities are their fierce independence, their intense fidelity to documentation and investigative journalism, a love of the First Amendment and social justice, also an equal dedication to attacking secrecy and surveillance in government and attacking the lapdog of corporate media. One of Izzy's first taste of corporate media cowardice was in the 40s when he brought a black judge to the press club. And they sat there for an hour and weren't served. And so he, in great anger, resigned. And as tit for tat, when somebody wanted to bring him back in, they blackballed him. And I don't think he ever forgot that sense of cowardice, and he was forever railing against the mainstream media that would not cover racism, went wholeheartedly for the Gulf of Tonkin crisis, and did nothing about secrecy and surveillance in FBI and in the CIA. And he, during the blacklist days, as Anna Marie alluded to, of the mid-20th century, Izzy could not find a paper that would take him, and he always joked about these little ragtag papers and the precariousness of speaking truth to power. He once quipped, "I always thought they would close by Monday," and they usually did. So he started the mom and pop 4-page weekly with his wife Esther, lugging the weekly around in his car trunk to sell, and his desire to be so totally independent of advertising is very clear. And he once said, "To sit in your bathtub and neither ask or want for anything, that is freedom." He was the first to expose the Gulf of Tonkin lie, just 3 weeks after LBJ used a mythical hit on the American ship as the excuse that got the United States into the Vietnam War. He became a hero to the anti-war movement, and his circulation went up to 70,000, which seems like nothing today in a media internet world. But at $5 a year, that was $350,000, and he had absolutely no overhead. So as he said often, he loved to say that he was a very rich war profiteer. The sadness is if mainstream media had followed Izzy, they might have halted that disastrous 10-year-long war. Similarly, Amy Goodman co-founded Democracy Now! On Pacifica Radio 19 years ago this month as an innovative model for truly independent grassroots political journalism, which also included no ads then or now. It has grown by leaps and bounds, and today Democracy Now! Is a national, daily, independent, award-winning news program hosted by Goodman and Juan Gonzalez, carried on more than 1,000 stations around the world and at democracynow.org. It is funded entirely through contributions from listeners, viewers, and foundations. As Goodman says, "We do not accept advertisers, corporate underwriting, or government funding. This allows us to maintain our independence. In addition, Goodman is an award-winning columnist and co-author of 5 New York Times bestsellers that always brings to her readers alternative voices often excluded by mainstream media. Mainstream media, in their idea of what constitutes balance, often means officially having 2 officials debating one another. That's not what you'd call a range. Democracy Now! Actually hosts real debates between people who substantially disagree, such as between the White House or the Pentagon spokesperson on the one hand and a grassroots activist on the other. Independence is never more important than now, says Goodman, for true democracy to work. People need easy access to independent, diverse sources of news and information. And she notes the last 2 decades have seen unprecedented corporate media consolidation. In the year 2000, just 6 corporations dominated the U.S. media. However, Izzy saw similar repression of real news back when there were only 3 networks and a few newspapers that the mainstream considered important. He was forever citing the cowardice of corporate newspapers and networks for ducking the real stories. And he actually was quite marvelous. I loved writing about him, and I knew him as a neighbor, and I love Celia. So this is close to my heart because he was fearless in his ability to go after the things that other people didn't do. And I think this is a candid view of the follies of PAC journalism, said by Ted Koppel, none other than Nightline's anchor back then. He said, of the establishment media, we are a discouragingly timid lot. People whose job it is to manipulate the media know that. Many of us are truly only comfortable when we travel in a pack. Izzy was a genius and a scholar, but he also had a gift of one-liners that Stephen Colbert would envy, and he constantly preached against such pandering by the press. Don't get conned by flattery and get cozy with officials, he said. You've really got to wear a chastity belt in Washington to preserve your journalistic virginity. Once the Secretary of State invites you to lunch and asks your opinion, you're sunk. And as Amy Goodman knows so well, here's another line of his. You can't just sit on their laps and ask them to feed you secrets, then they will just give you a lot of crap. And Teddy White wrote all these fawning political biographies, and this is just such a zinger. He said, any man who can be so admiring need never lunch alone. It reminds me of the modern-day TV bloviators who act like they're doing news and can scarcely get through a show without mentioning my close friend and fill in the blank with a political source. As Amy says about her work, these stories are set against the backdrop of the mainstream media's abject failure with its small circle of pundits who know so little about so much, attempting to explain the world to us and getting it all wrong. Izzy put it this way about journalists acting as shills for self-serving leaks. Establishment papers undoubtedly know a lot of things I don't, but a lot of what they know isn't true. And, he was... I guess I have to sort of back up. I knew people in the mainstream media that absolutely appalled me, including one who was known the dean of journalism, who routinely played tennis with Poppy Bush, number 1. And their argument always has been, oh, well, you'll get a scoop. Well, you only get what they want to tell you, and everybody should know that by now. But a lot of journalists, they can't resist that pull of having somebody come up to them and call them by their first name, not ever understanding that as soon as they get off the air or lose their newspaper, they're not going to be known at all. But so we've seen that, and Amy is brilliant in noticing that. And Izzy was such a pariah because during the McCarthy period, he took on J. Edgar Hoover and his racist and anti-Semitic hounding of innocent people during the 1940s, which included these questions of civil servants. Does he mix with Negroes? Does he have too many Jewish friends? Do you think he is excessive in opposing fascism or Nazism? Excessive. Did you ever hear him sing subversive songs? But he paid a price for that. Hoover set up his guard dogs on Izzy, and I tracked 5,000 pages of FBI files on him that went from 36 to 1972 when Hoover died. And they have had such marvelous disclosures as watching him go into his cigar store, taking down the license plates of people who came to visit their family, writing such clandestine letters as letters to his hearing aid company. And I think of all the taxpayers' dollars that were spent on hounding a man who thought and wrote everything he thought anyway. And today we have the KGB inquiry still going on by right-wing neocons, and there's absolutely nothing in all. I've read it all. There's absolutely nothing to accuse him of any being an agent. And in fact, the great establishment sage, excuse my voice, Walter Lippmann, spent more time talking to this press attaché, who was also a KGB agent, than Izzy ever did. But for some reason, there's this let's go dog Izzy till the ends of the world stuff still going on with neocon writers. To find the truth, Izzy found his Snowdens in the bowels of the government, hardworking, disillusioned men and women. That's how he got his major scoop on the FBI. He would be cheering Goodman's defense of Snowden and Chelsea Manning, now in prison for 35 years, for simply telling a terrible truth, showing a video of American helicopter soldiers chatting away as they gunned down civilians just walking in Baghdad, including a journalist. I think there's something terribly wrong when he gets such a sentence and Snowden can't return to this country even after winning the Pulitzer Prize. Izzy sounded like Goodman when he used to say, without dissent, there can be no democracy. I'm going to get into Amy. There's so much about Izzy I want to talk about, but I don't think I have the time. Although Amy and Izzy both have a disarming way of speaking softly while asking the toughest questions, Goodman was attacked by President Bill Clinton when he called a radio station on Election Day 2000, thinking he was going to get a quick get-out-the-vote message. Goodman challenged him for 28 minutes with questions about racial profiling, the Iraq sanctions, the death penalty, and NAFTA. Caught off guard, I mean, how dare a reporter ask questions? He said she spoke, quote, in a hostile, combative, and even disrespectful tone, period. And the next day she was banned from the White House. Well, that was nothing to what happened in 1991 while covering the East Timor independence movement. Goodman and fellow journalist Alan Nairn were horribly beaten by Indonesian soldiers after witnessing a mass killing of Timorese demonstrators. They recorded this massacre in a multi-award-winning documentary, Massacre, the Story of East Timor. This time, Goodman was banned from an entire country, but she ignored that international sanction twice and was deported each time she showed up. And despite mass killings for years by the Indonesian military, the crisis was largely ignored by the media until Goodman drew attention to it. I want to mention how her strong fighting against the establishment reporting of weapons of mass destruction totally mirrors Izzy's reporting of the Gulf of Tonkin. 3 weeks after LBJ used this as an excuse for starting the Vietnam War, he said, I've been looking at the after reports. He was an inveterate researcher, and he said, I see nothing. I see no debris. After reports on debris, if we hit something, shouldn't it have been known? And again, there's this sadness of people who are somewhat on the fringe, which is that if the rest of the media doesn't pick it up and use it, it can sit there for a long time. And that is, of course, what happened with weapons of mass destruction when you had the New York Times leading the way. And this last story shows, I think, Amy's zeal and her sense of principle. In 1998, Goodman and journalist Jeremy Scahill documented Chevron's corporation's rule in a murderous confrontation between a Nigerian army and villagers who protested yet another oil spill that had not been cleaned up. The soldiers shot and killed 2 innocent protesters and wounded 11 others. Then Amy and Jeremy interviewed the survivors, some of whom had been tortured. The 2 journalists then forced Chevron officials to acknowledge that Chevron had requested the use of and had transported the Nigerian military troops to their oil platform, which was being occupied by the unarmed and hapless villagers. The Goodman-Scahill documentary, Drilling and Killing, Chevron and Nigeria's Oil Dictatorship, won many awards, including the George Polk Award in 1998. Izzy had won a Polk Award, too, in 1971, but instead of being docile in a room crowded with establishment journalists, he embarrassed them by telling just who the hell George Polk was, which most of them had no idea. He lectured them on how sacred cows like Walter Lippmann had swallowed whole the United States cover-up of just how the correspondent George Polk was murdered during the Cold War. He was murdered by the Greek police, said Izzy shrilly, still angry after all these years, who tried to blame it on the left with compliance from the United States, he told an uncomfortable audience. So this story sums up what I.F. Stone and Amy Goodman are about, and that is journalistic independence at all costs. One of the many awards that Scahill and Goodman received for the documentary Drilling and Killing Chevron and Nigeria's Oil Dictatorship was from the Overseas Press Club. The 2 couldn't afford the fancy dinners, so they stood in the back and seized the opportunity to question Richard Holbrooke, Secretary of State, who was giving the keynote speech. The Overseas Press Club journalists, including Tom Brokaw, went ballistic. How seemly, asking questions of their guest. In fact, they had capitulated to Holbrooke, and as the club members huddled protectively around him as if to protect him from these 2 vicious reporters, they said, "We made an agreement with him. He wouldn't have come here tonight if we hadn't agreed that journalists would not ask questions." A floored Goodman said she was under no rules, and Izzy always refused background and off-record meetings, and he would just wait around and get the scoop from somebody who'd been there and was able to use it and not be breaking any rules. And they were about to escort Scahill out when Goodman shouted, "Release this man, he is about to get an award." But when it was her turn on stage, she told Brokaw, "Thanks, but no thanks," and did not accept the award. So, sounding like Izzy, she said they had to stand up to fight the cozy relationship between the media and sources. Amen? And Amy, here's this wonderful award. Thank you.
Wow, what an honor it is to be here. Thank you to the Nieman Foundation. What an honor it is to be here with Laura Poitras, to be here with Izzy's family, and with my own family, my brothers and sister-in-law, and my close friend Brenda. It is so important that we in the press take on power. I originally come from Pacifica Radio, which was founded in 1949 by a war resister named Lou Hill. When he came out of the detention camps, he was a conscientious objector. He said there has to be a media outlet that is not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. In 1949, the first station, KPFA. As George Gerbner, the former late dean of the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania, said, we need a media that's not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell that are raising our children today. And so Pacifica grew to 5 stations, mine in New York, BAI, Los Angeles, Houston. Fascinating, the Houston station, KPFT, in 1970, it went on the air, and within 2 weeks, it's the only radio station in the country that was blown up. It was blown up by the Ku Klux Klan. They strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter, and they blew it to smithereens. When the station got back on their feet, rebuilt their transmitter, the Klan blew it up again. Oh, they blew up the station right in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant. So finally, the third time when they rebuilt their station, it became a national event. PBS was broadcasting it, going back on the air, and Arlo came back to Houston to finish Alice's Restaurant. But I think the reason they blew it up is because of how dangerous Pacifica is, how dangerous independent media is, because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it is a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, whether it is an uncle in Iraq, an aunt in Afghanistan, it challenges stereotypes, it just destroys the caricatures that fuel the hate groups. There's nothing more powerful than hearing someone speak for themselves. It's not that you agree with them, but you begin to understand where they're coming from. And that's the beginning of peace. I believe the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, it is wielded as a weapon of war. And that has to be challenged. That has to change. There's a lot of retrospectives now as the U.S. is at the same time pulling out of Iraq and Afghanistan, actually increasing their presence in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's instructive to go back to 2003 when the war began and look at the corporate media at the time. You know, the media group FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting in New York, did a study of the 2 weeks around Colin Powell, then Secretary of State. I think it was February 5th, 2003, giving that push for war at the UN. That speech he would later call a blot on his career, where he said the final evidence is in on weapons of mass destruction. FAIR looked at the 4 major nightly newscasts in the 2 weeks around that speech, which was critical. It was 6 weeks before the invasion of Iraq, the most critical time when, as Noam Chomsky says, the media's manufacturing consent for war. And they looked at the 4 major nightly newscasts, NBC Nightly News, the ABC World News Tonight, CBS Evening News, and the PBS NewsHour. That 2-week period, there were 393 interviews done around war. This is at a time in the US when about half the population was for war, half the population was against war. 393 interviews done. How many were with anti-war leaders? 3. 3 of almost 400. That is no longer a mainstream media. That's an extreme media beating the drums for war. That has to be challenged. We need a media when we cover war that's not brought to us by the weapons manufacturers, when we cover climate change not brought to us by the oil, the gas, the coal companies, the nuclear companies, when we cover healthcare not brought to us by the insurance industry, by the drug companies. We need a media that is truly independent. That, I believe, is what will save us. My brother David and I wrote a couple of books, the first called The Exception to the Rulers. That should be what all the media is. It shouldn't just be the motto of Democracy Now!, the exception to the rulers. The second is called Static. And the reason we called it that is because even in this high-tech digital age with high-definition television and digital radio, still all we get is static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality, when what we need the media to give us is the dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. That's why it's also such an honor to be here with Laura Poitras, who risked everything. Already she'd been harassed by the government as she came in inside and outside the company, but who risked everything with Glenn Greenwald making their way to Hong Kong. Who knew what would happen? Ed Snowden certainly didn't know what would happen to him when he gave over these documents, but these journalists, I mean, it is a very dangerous time for journalists. What would happen to them? You know, under the Obama administration, there are more whistleblowers and journalists prosecuted than under all presidents combined. That is astounding. And yet she risked everything to what ultimately has changed the world. The information that has come out about surveillance, about what kind of country we want to be, what do we want to represent in the rest of the world, whether we're talking about surveillance or at home, or we're talking about detention at Guantanamo. I don't even like to use the word detention, use the words of the state, because they're so often propagandistic. Detention suggests short term. That's not imprisonment, it's detention. It's hardly detention, and they are hardly detainees when they are held for more than 10 years without charge, most of them cleared, and yet they remain at this prison camp. All of these need to be discussed. We need independent media, which is also, I see this award for all of my colleagues at Democracy Now! We began 19 years ago as the only daily election show in public broadcasting. We were broadcasting on 8 community radio stations, very proud, thought we'd be going through the primary season, and when the election happened, it happened to be the second election of President Clinton, then this project would wrap up. I actually was called to be the host of the show. I was at an underground safe house in Haiti. You know, in Haiti, people were gunned down when they went to the polls, in places like Timor as well. But in our country, most people didn't even vote. So I thought, well, why do an election show? But that actually intrigued me, because I never thought people were apathetic in the United States. But I wanted to know what people at the grassroots were doing. How were they engaged? Why didn't they vote? And so we used the primary system as a way to go from state to state to see what people were doing in their states. And after the election, there was more demand for the show than before, and more stations started to pick it up. And then September 11th happened, 5 years later, September 11th, 2001. And that week, we happened to begin a broadcast, coincidentally, September 11th, on the first TV station in New York. It was a public access station, Manhattan Neighborhood Network. We went on as emergency broadcasting, the closest national broadcast to the World Trade Center. And then it just took off. TV stations around the country would say, can you send us video cassettes? That was back then. And we soon were, the FedEx and the mailmen were picking up garbage bags filled with video cassettes. When they would play the video cassettes each day, then the radio station in the town, first it was Pacifica, then community college stations, NPR stations saying, can we play this show? And then PBS stations were saying, well, can we broadcast this program? And now, 19 years later, we're broadcasting on over 1,300 public radio and television stations around the country and around the world, translated also into Spanish, our headlines, because Spanish media, Spanish language media, suffers from the same concentration of corporate control of the media as the English language media does. We need independent media. I really see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day: war and peace, life and death. And anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country. They can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us in civilian society to have the discussions that lead to the decisions about whether they live or die, whether they're sent to kill or be killed. Anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. Thank you so much, Democracy Now!